Hello, welcome back. It's kind of a packed outline, and I may shove a couple of things to Thursday, like the story of Jenny Lynn. Not to be missed. She was the Beyonce of her time. But I may bring her back on Thursday. We're trying here to make this audacious, work by this audacious assumption that the past and present are somehow mingled, never identically. Parallels don't work in any linear way. But oh my goodness, there's so much talk out in our political conversation, if we're having a conversation, about potential civil war, the language of civil war, the language of violence, the threats of such. An Ohio State senator back in, I guess it was late June, got up, I guess it was after J.D. Vance was named the running mate. And he said America now faced its last chance and it must fight, he said. And quote, if it takes a civil war to take our country back, so be it. One of our candidates for president uses all kinds of language, not least of which was just the other day, where he said, there's an enemy within. We have an enemy within, which I think is much more dangerous than any outside enemies. There's an echo there of Lincoln's famous Lyceum speech of 1838. I don't think that candidate is even aware of that speech. A close relative of one of our candidates just boldly this weekend announced that the Democratic Party had tried to kill former President Trump. They tried to kill him. Okay? Shelby Bush, B-U-S-C-H, the representative of Arizona at the Republican National Convention, in fact, she was a co-chair of the convention, said that if her colleague in Arizona, who had been ahead of the vote count in 2020, where Arizona was certified for President Biden, if he walked into the room, she would lynch him. Americans have often used that word lynching too loosely. I always wonder if anyone who uses that term, do they know what a lynching was? A Georgia State senator named Colton Moore, in just late August, said that, quote, civil war would break out if President Trump did not win. He went on, do you want a civil war? I don't want to have to draw my rifle. Oh. Hold me back. Don't make me draw my rifle. Well, then don't draw it. Curtis Taylor of Georgia, podcaster, once ran for governor, got roundly defeated. She said at the end of last year, this is war, meaning our politics, and I hope and pray it gets resolved before we use our guns. Loose language, and I could go on and on here. There's a Michigan state senator named Maddock, who said that all of the legal charges, all the court cases that have built up over, a year and a half now, against former president, will lead to civil war, quote unquote. And then there's that lieutenant governor in North Carolina, Mark Robinson. I mean, He's the one who said, just some people just need killing. I mean, they need to be killed. Yeah, okay. And now we're talking about eugenics again, bad genes. So these are actually bad echoes of the 1850s. And one of the things I might suggest is that what's going on in the 1850s, which we'll get to here in 30 seconds, is all caught up in vicious and bitter conspiracy theories. I've mentioned this before, the slave power conspiracy, which the new Republican Party, which we'll see in a moment, come into existence, was so effective at selling as a political slogan, and not without some traction in reality. And then, of course, Southerners had for years, this wasn't brand new in the 1850s either, they had been painting abolitionists as a dire threat to the social order. Some of the abolitionists basically said, thank you very much. Yeah, we're threatening the social order. We are. Get ready. But that idea of the black Republicans, use of the term black as metaphoric, but not entirely, painting Northern abolitionists or even modestly anti-slavery people like the Republican Party, and some of its allies right here at Yale, painting them as racial amalgamationists, painting them as destroyers of the racial order, the social order, the political order, the future. All over the place in the 1850s, Americans had come to see each other, not always, but so frequently, through lenses of conspiracy, lenses of fear, lenses of the politics of fear. Unless we wish it away, politics is about fear sometimes. Only fools don't understand that. Here at Yale, in late spring, early summer, 1854, they had a Kansas-Nebraska meeting. They had what they called a Rifles for Kansas meeting. It was held in actually a place called Brewster Hall up the street, which was apparently the largest building in New Haven at that time. It no longer exists. But they gathered that it was a Yale event. It was essentially emceed and hosted by President Woolsey. All the most prominent faculty were there, including Nathaniel William Taylor, the great theologian, who had never been anti-slavery, frankly, but he was brought out of the, I don't know if closet's the right term, he was brought out to this gathering by the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the threat it posed to his own conception of an American social order. Leonard Bacon walked up the street from Center Church, the great colonizationist whose solution, like many others, had been removal of black people from America. But Bacon was angry about Kansas-Nebraska and becoming a Republican. And even the great Benjamin Silliman came, the great scientist. In and out of this slavery question most of his life, on both sides of it. And there was Benjamin Silliman getting up at the meeting and saying, I will buy 2 rifles. Nathaniel Taylor said, I will buy 2 rifles as well. Bacon said, I will buy, I don't know, it's in the book, 3 rifles. And they all started competing. I'll buy 1, I'll buy 2, I'll buy 3. Rifles for Kansas. Now, did they know where those rifles were actually going and to whom? No, probably not. But they knew that something was brewing in Kansas. There was going to be a conflict, and it was going to turn violent, they thought. And it would. It's going to be known as Bleeding Kansas within a year by 1855, 56. Come back to that in a minute. And this got a lot of attention in Southern newspapers. The Richmond Whig asked in an editorial if the South, quote, will longer submit to the degradation of patronizing northern colleges. Take that, Yale. It asserted, quote, better in our judgment that the children of the South should live and die in ignorance of even the letters of the alphabet than be subjected to the contaminating influences of northern instructors. Now, things are getting kind of bad when you're saying, I don't even care if my kid learns the alphabet as long as he doesn't have a Yankee teacher. There was a Connecticut-Kansas committee, like there was a Massachusetts-Kansas committee and a New York-Kansas committee, raising money, rifles, and so on. We couldn't ever quite figure out how many rifles they actually bought and provided that night in New Haven, but it was a remarkable turning point in Yale and New Haven's approach to this crisis over the expansion of slavery in the 1850s. Now, this is an incredible classic photograph of the California Gold Rush. Note the mixture here of Chinese and Anglo miners together with one of these sluice trays or whatever those were called, you know, trying to find gold in '49. And soon the whole issue gets unshucked. Have a look at this map a second, come back to it. It's going to help us at least grasp the geography of this crisis. But I want to start, and I don't think it's going to show up well. We'll come back to Stephen Douglas too. Whoops. That's Abraham Lincoln, the younger, before the beard, but it actually is right about the time of his nomination as the Republican candidate in 1860. So, but you can't really read that, but since I'm going to, in 1854, back to 54 I'll back up in a second to that Compromise of 1850 and the mess it left, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and then we'll get up to Bleeding Kansas and Dred Scott. All of these are turning points, like anything in history. You know, we know what's coming. We know where this is going. Never forget, they did not. Abraham Lincoln got brought back into politics because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He'd been in Congress, I said this before, one term in the Mexican War. He voted against the Mexican War. He supported a bill to end the slave trade in the District of Columbia while he was in Congress. He was still a Clay Whig. He's no radical abolitionist. In fact, Abraham Lincoln never belonged to an abolitionist society in his life. But he feared and hated the idea of slavery and especially its expansion. I hesitate to tell so many stories as I get off time, but after the passage of that Kansas-Nebraska Act, which I'll explain in a minute, Stephen Douglas, its author, senator from Illinois, a powerful senator from Illinois, went back to Illinois to kind of sell the bill. And just a week or so after the passage of the bill, which was you know, now a couple of weeks after, the country was dealing with like a storm. Like, what's this going to mean? Oh my God. Stephen Douglas goes to Springfield, Illinois, and gives a speech to the state legislature. Okay, makes sense. He's going to sell the bill. Long and gangly Abe Lincoln stood out at the door to listen. And then as the crowd was exiting the legislative hall, Lincoln went up. I don't know if you've ever been in the State House in Springfield, Illinois, but it was a balcony. And Lincoln went up on the balcony, and there he's standing. He says, I'm going to speak tonight, 7:30, up wherever it was going to be. Y'all come. I'm going to speak tonight. Abe, he had no agent, no speaking service. I'll be speaking tonight, did y'all come? This became known as, eventually, his Peoria speech, because he kind of gave it famously in Peoria, but this is the first place he gave it. And here's one of the things he said. And imagine the intelligence that he's asking of his audience. And if you don't mind, if you can stand it, think about the kind of intelligence we are demanding today of our political audiences, or not. To illustrate the case, Lincoln said, Abraham Lincoln, him, has a fine meadow containing beautiful springs of water, which John Calhoun, everybody knows who that is, a Central Illinois Democrat active in the 1854 campaign, had agreed with Abraham, originally owning the land in common, should be his, and the agreement had been consummated in the most solemn manner, regarded by both as sacred. Now, there he's referring back to the Missouri Compromise, way back in 1820, where they drew that imaginary line at the 3630 parallel and said slavery will never exist north of this line, which the new Republicans now are going to say it was a sacred pledge. John Calhoun, however, says Lincoln, Calhoun's dead by now, but Calhoun as symbol still played. John Calhoun, however, in the course of time had become owner of an extensive herd of cattle. The prairie grass had become dried up and there was no convenient water to be had. John Calhoun then looks with longing eye on Lincoln's meadow. Oh dear. And goes to it and throws down the fences and exposes it to the ravages of his starving and famishing cattle. Think, this is metaphor on metaphor here. He's asking the audience to think. Oh my God. You rascal, says Lincoln. What have you done? What do you do this for? Oh, replies Calhoun, everything is right. I've taken down your fence, but nothing more. It is my true intent and meaning not to drive my cattle into your meadow, nor to exclude them therefrom, but to leave them perfectly free to form their own notions of the feed and to direct their movements in their own way. It's the cattle's popular sovereignty. Now, would not the man who committed this outrage be deemed both a knave and a fool? This is Lincoln again. A knave in removing the restrictive fence, which he had solemnly pledged himself to sustain, and a fool in supposing that there could be one man found in the country to believe that he had not pulled down that fence for the purpose of opening the meadow to his cattle. End of metaphors. And then he just went about the business of attacking the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But this was so typical of Lincoln. Frederick Douglass was a genius at this too, laying out in a metaphor first, a whole set of metaphors, the story, enveloping his audience in it, getting your head inside the story through a metaphor. Already, you know where he's going. Okay. Excuse me. Don't drop your notes, dude. That was that quote. You couldn't read it, so what's the point, right? Yeah, back up with me. All right. In the Compromise of 1850, there was some reason to believe that this crisis had been met. Henry Clay surely tried. So did Daniel Webster. When they swilled down brandy on a cold winter night and said, "Man, we got to do some things here." And they did. They came up with 5 measures. The 5 measures of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Students, yes, you need to know these. Everyone else? Yes, you need to know these. They said first, all right, California will be admitted as a free state. It's going to happen anyway. Gold Rush is sending people out there by the thousands, and half of them are European immigrants. They're not going to be slaveholders. So yeah, we'll admit California is a free state. Webster sort of said to Clay when they were batting all this back and forth, how you want to sell that in the South? And Clay said, Secondly, though, they decided they would abolish slave trading in the District of Columbia, but not slavery itself, because Congress has jurisdiction over the District of Columbia. Webster said, fine with me. I can sell that in Massachusetts. Then Clay and Webster talked about the Texas border, which had never been settled, the western border of Texas. Since the Mexican War, the Mexican cession was all this land out here. And they proposed, and this passed eventually, that the border of Texas would be moved back 300 miles. Whoops, what did I do? Oh, okay, good. Oh, you have it, good. The Texas boundary would be moved back eastward 300 miles. Texas would be compensated with $10 million. It's a lot of money in 1850. And all of what is modern-day New Mexico would be opened up to a possible new slave state. In other words, the size of the Mexican cession would be broadened, telling the South, make as many slave states as you like, if you can. And then fourth, Webster hated this one, but he's going to give away his political career by saying yes. Clay said, we got to pass a new Fugitive Slave Act. The original federal Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution, it is in the Constitution that people are bound to somehow retrieve and return fugitive slaves, but it set up no apparatus by which to do it, no legal structure by which to do it. Clay said, Daniel, we're going to have a really strong new Fugitive Slave Act. Webster said, no, you can't do that. Clay said, yes, we have to. Webster said, okay. Damn. And that'll be the crux. That'll be the biggest part of the Compromise of 1850, the part that will cause all the violence and the rescues of fugitive slaves and begin to tear apart the very fabric they're trying to keep sewn together. The fifth part of the compromise was that they simply said any new states born out of the Mexican cession from the Mexican War, be that 2, 3, 4, 5 states other than California, the status of slavery shall be settled on the basis of popular sovereignty, meaning just let the people vote. When to hold that vote? They didn't. They didn't go on record. Popular sovereignty here again serves as a kind of what the great David Potter called a charm of ambiguity. Just have a referendum. Have democracy. It'll work. How? Don't know. Try it. Now, Stephen Douglas, the same Stephen Douglas who will soon, there he is, brilliant politician. His moral philosophy and his views are not always admirable at all, especially in retrospect. He was an incredibly powerful, energetic, brilliant orator, little short guy, about 5'6", and already in the Senate, already got great ambitions for the presidency. He becomes the principal legislative manipulator even of the compromise, and later, of course, of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It was his idea not to allow this bill of 5 measures to be voted on as an omnibus bill. If you got 5 huge things you're trying to do, And somebody's against every one of them. You know, there's going to be somebody to vote no on Measure 2 and Measure 4, and probably a significant number. Don't let people vote on the whole thing, because they all got something to vote no on. Vote on them one by one at a time. And maybe, just maybe, you can manage majorities each time. Let the people who hate that vote no, but we're going to get us to 51%. And that's exactly what they did. The votes were extraordinarily sectionalized now, Southern, Northern. It'll lead David Potter to call the Compromise of 1850 not a compromise at all. He called it an armistice. In retrospect, it gave an illusion, at least at first, to a certain sectional peace. Once it was finally passed, late August 1850, and by the way, all kinds of drama has occurred. Zachary Taylor, the President of the United States, the general from the Mexican War, who'd been elected in '48, has the audacity to die during the debates. I'm sorry, but he just kicked the bucket and he's gone. So what happens? His vice president becomes president. It's Millard Fillmore. Who is Millard Fillmore? Everyone's asking. Well, he's a Yankee from up in New England. Turns out he's a doughface, though, which was the anti-slavery Northerners' word for Northerners with Southern sympathies. Fillmore became a key player in this. Let's pass this, save the Union. Okay. And they did. There were some celebrations around the country. Oh my God, the Union had been saved. Or had it. The collapse of that compromise will come as fast as it was ever passed. There was something called the Georgia Platform passed in the Georgia State Legislature by fall of 1850. It called for conditional acceptance of this if the North did the same in good faith. They were challenging all the Northern legislatures to say, okay, we support this. I mean, they already, tacitly had through their representatives, but no, the Georgia Platform said, we're going to make you say. There were rallies in the North held by what were called Union Safety Societies or safety committees. And then very soon, and I should have had her picture up here, very soon, Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel came out. First serialized in the Washington, D.C. Intelligencer, serialized for actually a few months in early 1852. Chapters, a couple chapters at a time, a few chapters at a time. How many of you have actually read Uncle Tom's Cabin? Yeah, hey. We don't teach it much anymore. One of those books that everybody knows about, everybody thinks they know a lot about. Many people can name 3 or 4 characters in it, but have never read it. It sold 10,000 copies in the first week. Bestseller in the 19th century. It sold 1.5 million copies in England during the first year. It sold 300,000 copies in the United States in the first year. It's at 2 million copies by 1853. There'd never been a book sell like this. It was being published and printed in Boston. They were running, I forget now, 15, 20 presses a day to keep pumping these books out. And it's a monster, it's big. Most Northerners found it sort of objectionable at first, until they realized the effect it was having. The image of a panting slave chased by slave catchers and dogs, did finally catch them or capture them. Eliza escaping across the Ohio River, jumping from one iceberg to the next, and just getting away from those dogs. But the genius of that book, if you have any vague memory of reading it, the genius of Stowe's book was her uncanny ability to spread all the blame around. She had, my goodness, she had noble and gentle and kind slaveholders. She had horrific, terrible, Vermont-born slave masters like Simon Legree. He's a Yankee. St. Clair is the nicest person in the book, and he's a slaveholder. You got children. Oh my God, little Ava. I mean, you need a box of Kleenex to read this book. I mean, little Ava's going to jump off a ship. I mean, oh my God. The blame gets spread around. You even get into the house of a senator in Ohio who had voted for the Fugitive Slave Act to hold the Union together, and suddenly Eliza shows up with her child escaping slavery. And that senator says, oh my God, I made a mistake. You get conversions going on in this book. People get religion in this. It's got everything. And it's got the blood of Uncle Tom. The nicest, sweetest, good old guy who's a slave you could ever possibly imagine, who is just beaten to a pulp by Simon Legree, a Vermonter. The book is genius. And in the election of 1852, when Franklin Pierce, another good Yankee from New England with Southern sympathies, will be elected president, for every 4 votes cast for Franklin Pierce, the Democrat, in 1852, 1 copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin sold. I don't know, what will we have? 160 million people vote maybe in a month, or 170 million? I don't know, whatever. Can you imagine a book that would sell 40 or 50 million? No. I mean, a lot of authors might dream that or imagine that. It's that Fugitive Slave Act that turned the country on fire. It set up a system of enforcement, a set of so-called magistrates in every county. It claimed it was going to be in every county of the United States, of the North, whose job it was, they were called commissioners, whose job it was solely to adjudicate fugitive slave cases and return those fugitives to the South, if they were deemed to be real fugitives. And they would be paid twice as much money if they, quote unquote, convicted the runaway slave than if they did not. Southerners snuck this in and kind of just, said this to their northern colleagues because they didn't trust them. There's all kinds of violent reaction now, rescues of fugitive slaves all across the North. A lot of people got converted to at least some kind of, this is what happened to some of these folks at Yale. They got converted to some kind of at least modest form of anti-slavery now by that Fugitive Slave Act, because it made you complicit in the return. It made it a felony if you had even an awareness, that's what the law said anyway, if you had any awareness of a fugitive slave in your neighborhood, in your town, and you did nothing about it, it's a felony. And people were made now complicit with this system. And even if you feared, black people, you were Leonard Bacon who wished they could all be colonized and so on and so forth, you didn't want the government to try to make you retrieve a fugitive slave who's risked everything to try to be free. You didn't want to do that. And people are reading slave narratives. They're reading Douglass and others. All right. Kansas-Nebraska became what our man here, Stephen Douglas, called a hell of a storm. Why? What is it? Let me take you back at least briefly to the map. Yeah, immediately in the wake of the Compromise of 1850, such as it was, all this resistance, and indeed violent resistance going on across the North, rescues of fugitives, and so on, it was perfectly clear that everything that was left, oh, you can't see me, do that. Everything that was left of the old Louisiana Purchase, the Kansas territory and the Nebraska territory, all of that yellow territory up there, and many people didn't even know where the western boundaries of this thing were supposed to be, all that territory was now going to become available to become states soon. How? By what means? Would slavery exist? Maybe, maybe not. Stephen Douglas, he thought, to the rescue. Now, party politics is huge here, folks. Huge. Don't have to like party politics, but if you don't, you won't know any history. It's worth remembering that in the early 1850s, and with all this turmoil going on, and now including violence, and many people now for the first time justifying violence and what they deem self-defense of fugitive slaves, most Americans still had to get up every day and make a living as farmers and mechanics and everything in between. They worried about the price of wheat. They were worried about their sons and daughters getting land. They were worried about a sick cow. They were worried about whether their daughter might marry an Irishman. Worst fear of all. So there had to be some answer. And it was fueled also by the awareness, more than awareness. It's been roiling in Congress now for some years. How would the United States build a transcontinental railroad? We're now in the decade of railroads. 60,000 miles of railroad is going to be built in the 1850s. And where would the eastern terminus be? Would there be one? Would there be two? Would there be a northern transcontinental railroad, a southern transcontinental railroad? And guess who was chairman of the Western Territories Committee? Stephen A. Douglas. And Stephen Douglas thought, that terminus of the Transcontinental Railroad, of course, should be in Chicago, and then St. Louis, right across the Mississippi from Illinois. He had this all figured out. And if you could arrange the Western Territory question now about slavery and get it contained, get it compromised, get it under control, then you can build these railroads, and a whole lot of folk, his friends, can make millions. As people will eventually on the transcontinentals. Stephen Douglas proposed 3 different versions of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. I urge you to write this down. I hate to sound so old-fashioned, but you do need to know this. So that when you get asked, I used to say out at the mall, but nobody goes there anymore. When you get asked by the person on the street, why are all these Republicans talking about the Kansas-Nebraska Act? You'll know. His first bill of 3 simply proposed that a state, he said, shall be admitted from the new territories, quote, with or without slavery as their Constitution may prescribe at the time of admission. Did you hear that? With or without, however they do it. Didn't lay out any method. And everybody who heard that kind of said, Stephen, can you put a little meat on them bones? What's up? And quickly he realized now there's going to have to be a second one. So he tried a second one. And by the way, he's under tremendous pressure here from the southern wing of the Democratic Party. His fellow Southerners want this Illinois boy to give them what they want, which is an eternal hold on slavery in the Western Territories. So he proposes a second version. He moved to a, quote, direct statement of popular sovereignty. He said the definition would be, quote, left to the people residing therein. It was the same thing he said in the first version. But now we're going to call it popular sovereignty. They're going to have a referendum. Didn't indicate when. Not enough, say his Southern friends. Not enough at all. What they wanted, they're going to get. They wanted a direct repeal of the Missouri Compromise line, which had been the federal restriction on expansion of slavery in law since 1820. They wanted that just repealed. And the story is, it's true. Stephen Douglas goes for a carriage ride one day in Washington with two Southern senators, especially Archibald Dixon of Kentucky, a Whig, other party. They're making deals. And Dixon said to Douglas, you haven't done enough. You got to repeal Missouri. You got to write a third version. You got to put everyone's feet to the fire. South wants permanence for slavery in the West. And Stephen Douglas, we're told, said, quote, by God, sir, you're right. I will incorporate it into my bill, though I know it will raise a hell of a storm. And it did. Kansas-Nebraska Act is very simple. If you look up the language, I think we have in the Gannett book, I think we have the text. It's very simple. Number one, it repealed the Missouri Compromise line and any geographical restriction against slavery in the West. And secondly, it said all new territories will be settled on the formula of popular sovereignty, leaving the timing of that decision in any given territory ambiguous. Now, here's the key. This is hand-drawn. I apologize for that, but I think you can read it. I made a mistake originally, and I had to cross them out and change it, but I've always liked this because of my mistake. The vote in Kansas-Nebraska in the House of Representatives, where the North has a significant majority. The point here is to see how sectionalized this question had become. They're not voting as parties anymore, not really. And that's the danger. I've been saying this for years. Journalists will ask, what are the signs that our union is in some trouble? I said, watch the political parties. Watch the political parties. If they start breaking up or have their own internal civil wars, or one of them drastically changes to the left or the right, watch out for the union. Northern Democrats split almost right down the middle. 44 in favor, 42 nay, and for the Democratic Party, Stephen Douglas is a Democrat, this was a litmus test of their party. But 44 Northern Democrats vote against this. Southern Democrats, 57-2. I've never figured out who those two were. Don't ask me. They're lonely. Northern Whigs, what's left of the Whig Party in 54, 45-0. They're all going to be Republicans within a year. Southern Whigs, there aren't many left, go 12-7. They're split. Oh dear. And those Free Soilers, 4-0. It passes 113-100 in a utterly sectionalized vote. Oops, that's Jenny. We don't want to talk about Jenny yet. Now, all right. Out of this comes many turning points. And that's what that's the game we always play with the 1850s. What's your favorite turning point? Or you can play the same game with the coming of whatever. Coming of the Great Depression. Economic historians love to go back and kind of trace turning points in the world's economy and turning points in ratios of trade balance and imbalance and so on and so on and so on and so on. And some of them will say, you see, right there in 1828, I see it. There it's coming. No, it's in 27. No. World War I, how do you chart the revolution of it? It used to be an incredible parlor game to try to explain When does the Civil War become inevitable? Was it ever inevitable? I put that term here on, I think I put it in quotes, yes. I gave you an essay on the canvas that I did for the New York Times Magazine 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago. They put the word, or I think it was inevitable, in the title. I didn't want it there, but they did. Generally, we historians don't like the concept of inevitability. And that may be obvious. If you start thinking most things are just inevitable, then you don't need us. Why ask a bunch of historians to start explaining the roots and origins of something if it was all inevitable anyway? But we know that's not true. We know something about contingency. We know how this event affects that event, and this person, these people, this persuasion, this party, this group, this issue forced people to respond in ways they never had before, and so on and so on. But Kansas-Nebraska is a huge turning point. In my own humble opinion, not quite as important as the Dred Scott case, but close. But the Kansas-Nebraska Act led, did it not, to the formation, of course, of the Republican Party. Now, just last week, Vice President Harris held a big campaign event in Ripon, Wisconsin. That's the one Liz Cheney appeared with her at. And the story is in the little old white schoolhouse there is where the Republican Party was born in the late spring, literally just weeks after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, when a whole bunch of old Whigs and a few old Democrats got together and said, we need a new party dedicated to the eternal resistance to the expansion of slavery. Almost exactly the same time, similar group was meeting in Jackson, Michigan, and a couple places in northern Ohio. There's never really been another moment quite like this in all of American political history. Now, we've had other third parties. We have them right now. About to possibly cause enormous mischief. And we've had other, the Free Soil Party guy, I told you, got 10% of the vote in 1848. Incredible. The Bull Moose Party back under TR, and so on, and so on, and so on. We've even had Ross Perot's come along, who wasn't supposed to be part of any party, and got, what did he get, 18% or some god-awful number? It was unbelievable. Had a lot to do with getting Bill Clinton elected. But there's never been a moment in American political history when a political party born out of a crisis over a huge issue, future of slavery in the country, comes together, builds a motley new coalition of former Whigs, former Democrats, a bunch of nativists who now decide they fear slavery in the West just about as much as they hate Catholics. And they're going to form this weird coalition within a year, and almost elected John C. Fremont president in 1856. Not quite. But they're going to come so close, their first time out in a presidential contest in 56, that they're going to end up calling it the victory within defeat. Now, in our politics today, who accepts victories within defeat? And then they're going to elect the President of the United States 6 years after their founding. And it's going to lead to all-out civil war. I've always said this, I've said this 10,000 times. If you want a political realignment in your country, you kind of have two choices, historically. Either the Great Depression or the Civil War. Which would you vote for? Oh, I'll take my depression anytime. Yeah, I'll 25% of people out of work. Yeah, I'll take that. Civil War, it killed 700,000 people. Nah, maybe I won't take that. But those are the two times when we had fundamental political realignment. In the 30s, around the Depression and the New Deal, and a new Democratic Party that came out of that in the New Deal coalition. Took some time. And the other one is this Republican Party, this motley coalition of the 1850s. But also immediately, in the wake of Kansas-Nebraska, was the outbreak of what became known as Bleeding Kansas. Out in the border, in Kansas itself, a civil war broke out. The worst kind, local, vigilante, village against village, settlement against settlement. It killed around 250 people eventually, lots of treasure, farms burned, towns burned, and it will give us John Brown. We'll talk about him next time, who is himself going to go to Kansas and raise as much hell as he can as an honest-to-God, genuine radical abolitionist with a vision of tearing apart the Union. But that Republican coalition now is soon going to be potent as a political force, and they build themselves on this idea of a slave power conspiracy. Now let me take you into 1857, 56, 57. 56 is an extraordinary, my clock is running out on me. 56 is an extraordinary political election, a general election in itself. John C. Fremont, who's an explorer, the so-called pathfinder, dashing, youthful, Western explorer. People loved Western explorers. He wasn't quite Kit Carson. Fremont was a jerk in a lot of ways. It was about his own celebrity, and he married famously. That didn't hurt him. Against a guy named Buchanan. Buchanan was a Pennsylvanian, a classic doughface, a northerner of Southern sympathies, fully kind of in the pocket of slaveholders. And I'll leave you here, because apparently I have to. It's all right. Buchanan is inaugurated president within 1 week of the passage of the Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott decision had been coming through the courts for 15 years. I'll give you the background next time, but that case had been, stumbling and slow walking, first through the Missouri courts, 2 levels of it, and finally to the Supreme Court. Got on a docket in 1854. But it was such a touchy case. And Roger B. Taney, who, here he is. You want a villain? Everybody loves to hate Roger B. Taney now. And not without reason, folks. He wrote the worst, maybe the second or third worst Supreme Court decision in American history. Take your pick. Roger Taney was 80 years old in 1857. He was Chief Justice of the United States. He had a court that was exceedingly partisan. Imagine that. He's got 5 slaveholders, or people who were born into and grew up in slaveholding families, including himself from Maryland. He's got 2 others who are Northerners, but are deeply sympathetic with Southern slavery. He had a 7-2 majority on almost anything resembling the problem of slavery. He had 2 other Northerners who will write extraordinarily dissents in this case. And they're kind of lost to history, but their dissents are absolutely brilliant. But when this case comes before them, they don't want to touch it at first. There's a slave from Missouri. His owner took him into Illinois, a free state, back in the late 1830s, for God's sake. Then that owner took him up to the Minnesota Territory, to Fort Snelling, because the guy was a doctor, and Dred Scott lived there for years, married a young woman named Harriet. They had 2 kids born on free territory, free soil. And then the good doctor brings him back to Missouri, and then died. And transferred Dred Scott and his family to his heirs. But Dred Scott had some friends. He had friends in Missouri who took his case to court. He said, wait a minute, this man has lived for years on free soil. What does free soil mean? So it went to the circuit court, and he won. But it was repealed to the Missouri Supreme Court, which had 3 judges. I'll stop here. 3 judges. Vote was 2-1 against Dred and Harriet. And so Dred and his friends appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. It didn't have to even get to a decision by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court obviously decides what decisions, what cases it wishes to take. They finally took this. Note it got on the docket in '54, Kansas-Nebraska. Bleeding Kansas, the Civil War in Kansas is going on while they're trying to decide, oh shit, do we want to take this case? Tawney finally says, you bet we do. We have an opportunity here. Think of our own Supreme Court now, or various Supreme Courts you know about in American history. Tawney decided, you bet we can take this case because we can make a big decision here. Not just because I want to be famous, but because we can settle this question once and for all. Hubris doth make the world go round. And they will try to do that. And you want partisanship? Before Buchanan was even inaugurated, he's getting messages, letters from 2 members of the Supreme Court, alerting him to the decision that's coming and saying, James, you want to mention this in your inaugural address? Here's what we're going to do. I mean, we know our Supreme Court now is, I'm sorry, corrupt and tainted by partisanship, to say the least. But we don't have any evidence yet that court justices are calling up the president. I hope. They're not supposed to do that, but they were. And when this decision was announced, much more than Kansas-Nebraska ever had, it fueled the slavery crisis as never before. And within 3 years, it's going to make Abraham Lincoln president after he gets defeated for the Senate against Stephen Douglas. I'll stop there.